Hello, I am Darrell West, Senior Fellow in the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And I would like to welcome you to this session of Asia Undercurrent. Today's discussion is going to focus on tackling disinformation, the international community's fight to protect information integrity. Many countries around the world are experiencing a dramatic increase in disinformation. There are organized efforts to spread false narratives, and this is complicating everybody's ability to solve problems. It is a particular challenge in 2024 because nearly half of the world will be voting, and this includes the United States, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Pakistan, the European Union, and many other places. Many people around the world are worried about whether these elections will be decided based on false narratives. And part of the problem is that there are new tools for creating and disseminating disinformation. Recent advances in generative AI have brought the technology to everyone around the world. Anyone can be a content creator and develop fake videos and audio tapes. We've already seen that in the United States, and there also have been examples in Argentina, Slovakia, and other places around the world. So we need to figure out how to deal with disinformation while also preserving our principles of free speech and an open exchange of ideas. To help us with this discussion, we are pleased to be joined by three distinguished experts. Dr. James Pamment is the director of the Psychological Defense Research Institute at Lund University in Sweden. He is an internationally renowned expert in analyzing foreign interference and information influence operations. At his institute, he leads a team that provides research to the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency and other government agencies. He has advised and trained people at the United Nations, European Union, NATO, tech companies, and other governments as well. Dr. Jonathan Ong is an associate professor of global digital technology and director of the GlowTech Lab at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in the United States. He has published several books and articles on digital politics, global media ethics, and disinformation. He has analyzed the role of paid trolls and public relations experts on disinformation production and how disinformation thrives across different countries. Dr. Maiko Ichihara is a professor in law and international public policy and assistant vice president for international affairs at Hitotsubashi University. She undertakes research on disinformation, foreign influence operations, and ways to protect democracy. She serves on the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy, the East Asia Democracy Forum, and the Japan Fact Check Center. For our discussion, we will start with opening statements from our three panelists. Then we will have some discussion with the panel, and then we will take questions from the audience. So we encourage you to submit your questions online. If you are viewing this event live from the Nikkei channel or YouTube Live, you can submit your questions by scrolling down to the submission link below. And we encourage you to include your affiliation and title when submitting your questions. So our first statement will come from Professor James Pamment of Lund University in Sweden.
Thank you, Darrell, and it's a pleasure to be here. When I was thinking about how to begin this panel, I wanted to begin with what for me is the single most important question anyone who wants to counteract the effects of disinformation has to think about. And that question is, what capabilities do we need? What do we need to develop in-house? What do we need to buy in? Who do we need to collaborate with in order to counteract these negative effects? And to get to that point, I think there's some conceptual problems that we first need to consider. And that is really, what do we mean when we say disinformation? Because if you look at this from a historical perspective, disinformation is a very specific technique of misleading people to disinform. Often it's not really what we're talking about. And often it feels like what we're talking about is fake news, and we use disinformation almost as a synonym for that. I think it's quite problematic. So the way I would like to begin is by separating out the problem into three distinct areas, and then talk about the capabilities that are needed to deal with each of these problems. And these are all, in some way called disinformation, but I think teasing out the differences between them is quite important for the rest of the discussion. So the first area that I would like to speak about is actually what we might call misinformation or disinformation or malinformation sometimes. And this is where there's false information and it's being spread either intentionally or unintentionally, or it's being distorted in some way. And so the focus is really on whether the content is true or not, and whether the person who's spreading it really meant to do it. And we're at a very kind of simple level. We're talking about individuals spreading things. Maybe they're lying, maybe they misunderstood, maybe they just don't know, and they're talking, they're engaging, but they're saying things that may be problematic. And a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about disinformation is actually this kind of stuff. It's people just being wrong, or people lying because it's their protected right to do that. And the kind of capabilities then that you would need to have as a government or as an NGO working on this is obviously fact checking. That's the main tool. You see someone saying something wrong, and you prove that it's wrong by asserting the truth. Or you deal with questions of public resilience. So you train people in media literacy. You train them from a young age in how to understand how the media works, how to think about the information they receive, how to criticize sources, really to empower the public to be able to participate in democratic debate. So when we're talking about elections, obviously this is a big part of the issue. Democratic participation should be based on verifiably correct information. If someone's spreading lies, we want fact-checking capabilities, and we want people to have their own resilience to falsehoods. But really that's only one of the problem areas that we're discussing when we talk about disinformation. The second is what we might call influence operations or information influence operations, which is where there's some kind of coordinated effort, often involving covert dimensions, often using illegitimate communication techniques such as spreading disinformation, or using bots, or using AI and deepfakes, with an intent to cause harm for the benefit of the actor. Now, it can be organized criminal groups doing this in order to make money. It can be interest groups trying to achieve some kind of goal, political goal. It's been known for PR companies to offer these kind of services. And essentially what they're doing is using coordinated means to manipulate public debate. Disinformation is a small part of that. One of the techniques, among others, that's used to manipulate that debate. So often when we're talking about disinformation in that respect, in fact, the countermeasures and the capabilities that you would need as a government are quite different. You would need analysis, such as monitoring skills, open source intelligence skills, so that you can tease apart the campaign and understand how it was created and potentially who was behind it and what they're trying to achieve. And then when you're trying to counteract it, you would need not just fact-checking, but kind of counter-narrative approaches. So trying to engage the bigger narratives, the bigger stories that are being told across these campaigns, and to counteract those, which is quite different to fact-checking, where you're just correcting a simple falsehood. So that's the second area that I think is important to be clear about. And then the third is what we might call foreign interference, or FIMI if you're in the EU, which is actually where a foreign state actor with hostile intent is behind some kind of covert campaign. And the difference here, and it's very similar to an influence operation, but the main difference is that state actors have access to an array of other influence techniques, and that can be their diplomacy, their trade, their military, their intelligence capabilities and espionage, their cyber capabilities, their hybrid capabilities. And here you see information being used in coordination with those other capabilities. So it's not just the information influence campaign itself, but it's information influence in conjunction with other state capabilities. And the countermeasures for dealing with that are, of course, your secret intelligence capabilities, counterintelligence capabilities, and the security policy apparatus that's capable of deterrence and that ongoing dialogue with the hostile state. Your ability to attribute and politically go out and say that a certain government is behind certain campaigns, and possibly to develop policies and legislation. So with those 3 points, my opening statement is really that when we're talking about disinformation, we need to be clear about which kind, because some are really just about individuals being wrong. Others are about incredibly powerful governments using their whole kind of negative capabilities to affect democracy in countries that they want to try and influence. So which are we talking about, and which capabilities we need to develop, I think is a really key question for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. That's very helpful to have the breakdown of 3 different types and the different kinds of responses and capabilities that are required to deal with each of them. Our next statement will come from Jonathan Ong.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Jonathan Ong. I'm Director of GlowTech Lab at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And I just want to share direct experiences. I'm doing research in the disinformation space. And I want to also express this from my own position as a scholar in the Global North, where my majority interests and research areas are in the global majority. In the Global South, most of my research has focused on Southeast Asia, on the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, examining their political systems, their media environments, and their vulnerabilities to online bad actors. And at the same time, quite recently, doing more comparative work with Latin America, so looking and learning from Brazil, and in conversation with other global majority countries. And so, first of all, I got into this work looking at it from the perspective of workers. When the 2016 elections, the words disinformation, fake news, misinformation were in a way brand new to our global lexicon. They were also used as explanatory frames to explain some surprise electoral victories. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, the populist authoritarian leader, was elected into power in May 2016. And that was one of the explanatory frames used to justify and express how he won over the masses in a surprise electoral victory. Obviously, Brexit happened later in the summer of 2016, and Donald Trump got elected. And so I was interested from the perspective of who actually were the fake news producers, who were the authors of those false news websites, who were the actual online workers. Are they hired to be an online troll? Is that their job title? And so I interviewed a range of digital campaign specialists in the Philippines and worked my way down the hierarchy, right? So interviewing first the key political consultants associated with politicians, and then asked them for referrals to the influencers hired in their campaigns, and also some of the lower level copy-paste workers who are actually just executing and implementing the sharing and the spreading of certain memes, certain posts, certain narratives. And so what I learned from my work is that disinformation is often used in a way as kind of like an easy explanatory frame that, you know, these are the expressions of the uneducated. These are the expressions of the brainwashed, of people who have, you know, taken some in a way kind of been influenced by a leader or some narrative of some sorts, went down a rabbit hole. But in my work, I try to understand and also expose it as a professionalized operation, that it is actually folded in within legitimate, so-called respectable creative industries. And so it's important, as James Pamment has shared, to really understand the long histories of what we call disinformation. And in my work, I show how it is folded in digital campaigning, advertising, public relations, search engine optimization. These are legitimate industries that provide a cover to some of these kinds of insidious campaign strategies. So that's my work on the disinformation economies, and how in my work I also show how in much of the global south, these digital industries are thriving. These are sources of income for people. People are often not just spreading disinformation out of, ideological adherence to a leader or to an ideological cause, but just to get another paycheck. This is just a sideline on top of their day job, right? And so it's important to find ways to address disinformation at its roots, and not just to treat it in this kind of whack-a-mole fact check kind of way in which we're trying to capture fake news once it's already spread. And if I may share my more comparative research on looking at disinformation economies in the Philippines with Brazil, and also hoping to share some of these insights with some of our viewers as they prepare for the many elections in 2024. So my colleagues and I at GlowTech partnered with Brazilian academics, and we've hosted what we call a South-to-South knowledge exchange space against disinformation. And our argument is that a lot of the disinformation solutions often center the global north, where institutional and regulatory measures to address disinformation are very much present. There's very strong regulatory agencies within governments. There's stronger trust in governments to be relied upon to craft new laws and regulatory agencies that capture disinformation. We don't have those similar mechanisms in the global majority or the global south. And that's why we were trying to convene a conversation, and we invited civil society leaders and academics from a vast range of countries, including India, Indonesia, Moldova, to join our conversation comparing Brazil and Philippines elections. And what we found there really was it's important to offer a whole of society approach to addressing disinfo. It is not just left to the journalists. It's not just left to legal experts to craft laws to solve disinfo. But as James has said as well, it is important to include civil society in the broadest sense, to develop counter narratives, to work with communities at the grassroots, not to talk down on communities for being fooled by disinformation, right? But actually to empower them as agentic citizens, to see them as capable citizens, and address their resentments and anxieties head on through powerful counter narratives. So I'd like to end my statement there and look forward to the rest of this conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan. I like that concept of disinformation economies and the financial incentives that people have to create and spread disinformation. And we will come back to that point in a moment to talk about ways to address that. And I also like that point about the need for comparative research, like especially this year when so many different countries are going to be having elections. And so there's going to be lots of different types of disinformation campaigns. And I think it's really important for countries to learn from one another and try and figure out what works versus what is less effective. Our last opening statement will be from Maiko Ichihara.
Okay, well, thank you, Darrell. It's a pleasure to be here. As a scholar of foreign influence and information manipulation, or FIMI, focusing on China's narrative creation in Japan, I would like to point out 4 lessons I can share about disinformation. And well, there's a lot of overlap with James' points. First, disinformation is just one tool in their FIMI campaigns, and we should look at the whole narratives they are trying to spread through the use of disinformation. Disinformation from Russia about Ukraine came to Japan on a massive scale in the aftermath of Russian aggression of Ukraine in February 2022, with the help of Russian and Chinese trolls, as well as conspiracy theorists in Japan. It included such false information as that neo-Nazis had carried out a massacre of Russian residents in eastern Ukraine, and that some chemical weapons facilities were located in Ukraine with the support of Western countries. With such disinformation, Russia wanted to position itself as if it were on the side of defense and peace. It shows that even those authoritarian actors like Putin understand the power of norms and try to use norms such as peace and human rights norms. The second lesson from this case is that too much focus on disinformation alone can lead us astray, despite the legitimate concern that disinformation can make truth difficult to discern and destabilize society. Russian disinformation about Ukraine became effective when used in combination with other information that cannot be dismissed as outright lies. These included claims that NATO's eastward expansion posed a threat to Russian security. This narrative served to legitimize Russian aggression as a defensive action, at least in a subjective sense. In Japan, this narrative influenced the discussions of some progressive intellectuals and former politicians, not to mention those who have always been close to Russia. With their sense of media literacy, that they must seek alternative sources of information, not only Western sources, they referred to the Russian narratives and tried to find a neutral position in talking about this war. When I conducted a correspondence analysis on the relations of wars used in articles that are considered whataboutism, the results showed that negative adjectives were more closely associated with the West and NATO than with Russia in their articles. This gives us a third lesson. FIMI actors try to cultivate existing divisions in societies. Therefore, understanding the divide in one's own society, bridging the divide, and building trust between groups are of paramount importance. Most of the Japanese progressives who made whataboutist arguments back then are not supporters of authoritarian countries like Russia and China. In addition to the fact that they saw value in ending the war rather than continuing it, they had a habit of being critical of information that was too closely aligned with the discourse of the governments of Japan and the West. The case of the discharge of treated water from Fukushima in last August gives us a fourth lesson. Counter-narratives, if successfully created, can help defend society. The Chinese Communist Party seems to have had 3 goals in its disinformation attacks against Japan at the time of the discharge. They tried to divide Japanese society over the issue, to drive a wedge between Japan on the one hand and Taiwan and South Korea on the other, and to divert the eyes of Chinese citizens from domestic issues to foreign affairs. As I understand it, the main goal of the CCP was to discern and distance South Korea and Taiwan from Japan. Taiwan and Japan, as well as South Korea and Japan, have been strengthening their security ties against China in recent years. So the CCP wanted to appeal to the anti-treated water camps in Taiwan and South Korea and incite them to fight against their governments. Thus, Much of the disinformation about the treated water was spread from China to South Korea and Taiwan, not to Japan directly. But what did not succeed was the attempt to destabilize Japanese society. Faced with a massive FEMI campaign of not only disinformation, but also irritation and DDoS-like attacks using telephone calls to damage the continuation of normal life, as well as a total ban on the import of seafood from Japan, the Japanese media began to report on such attacks and the suffering of the targeted business owners, municipal officers, and fishermen. This caused sympathy in society, which led many to support the Fukushima stakeholders with tax donations, food purchases, and so forth. In other words, Japanese citizens went on a boycott and were united. In this SNS age, emotional stories tend to go viral. And they are not only stories of anger and hatred, but also those of sympathy, heartwarming, and inspiration. This was a rather fortunate case for Japan, however, that such a positive outcome occurred despite the absence of concerted efforts. To combat disinformation in FEMI as a whole, we must prepare our society to proactively create positive counter-narratives among related stakeholders, especially among private actors. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Maiko. I think that's a very important point you make about analyzing disinformation in the context of the existing divisions that exist within every society. And you provide some examples of that. In Japan and the United States, we've seen the same thing. Americans are divided by politics, race, gender, geography, and many other things. There's a lot of evidence that Russia has tried to convey information that exploits those divisions and accentuates them and makes them worse. So it is important to highlight that point. So for each of you, I want to come back to this issue of remedies because it's kind of easy to diagnose problems, and we all can cite examples of disinformation that have developed in each of our countries. It is always a little harder to kind of think about what we can do about it. And I know when I give talks in various places around the world, people are often focused on the question of solutions, like what can we do? What can we do to protect ourselves as individuals? What can we do to protect our countries? And I like the fact that each of you in your opening remarks actually gave some clues about possible remedies. So James, I know with your 3 types of disinformation, you propose possible remedies based on fact-checking, developing counter-narratives, and developing counterintelligence, depending on kind of the type and severity of the misinformation that is being communicated. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on each of those things, how countries can address those things, how countries can actually develop the capabilities that would help each nation deal with disinformation.
It's a challenging question, of course. If it was easy, we would have already solved this problem. So a big part of it is actually finding the political will to find the solution, and then finding the technical side of it, so that the solution is actually that it's actually possible to follow through and implement what we want. Because actually, so much of this is dependent on things like media monitoring, which is quite straightforward. Many corporations buy in media monitoring already. They know what everyone's saying about them. They can get sentiment analysis. The problem is, how do you go from media monitoring in the case of disinformation to some shareable insight that you can hand over to the teams who are going to work on countering the disinformation? So that may involve, for example, classifying which manipulation techniques are being used. Now, there's a system for doing that called Disarm that has around 280 classifiers at the moment, which means that someone, or hopefully in the future a machine, would be able to go through the data that's been kind of brought into the system through the monitoring and classify everything that's happening, save the evidence, and basically say what the technique is and why it's a problem. Once you have that, then you still need to be able to share that data Now, if it's a country that's collecting that data, perhaps their monitoring capabilities are protected, which means that even if it's open source data, they can't share what they've collected because it would reveal something about how they're collecting the data. If it's copyrighted data, it may be a problem. If there's personal data in it, it may be a problem. So how do you share it in a big database where everyone, including the NGOs, the think tanks, the academics, can all put that data in one place and try and understand what's there? Once you've done that, if you can solve that problem, how do you then lift out the attribution from that data and explain it to decision makers in such a way that they would be prepared to make the political choice to go out and say, we think that Russia's behind this, or we think that China's behind it, particularly if it's data that's come in through these mixed methods from different sources. And then you have the decisions about what to do, if it's a counter narrative, if it's counter messaging, if you're going to target certain vulnerable groups in society. So there's a huge amount of decisions that need to be made, and an extremely complex series of processes that would need to be followed. At the moment, I would say generally we're at the very early stage of being able to deal with each of these, and we're sort of flying the airplane while we're building it. Right? It's an ongoing iterative process. I think there's exciting things that are happening, particularly in the EU and in some of the wealthier countries, as Jonathan was talking about. You know, that's where the capabilities are, that's where the money is and the resources are. So there are things happening. It may eventually lead to tech that can be shared, processes that can be shared with the rest of the world. But we're quite a long way from that at this point, I would say.
Thank you, James. Jonathan, similar question to you. What are the best ways to counter disinformation? And I also want to reiterate, you mentioned this notion of the financial incentives that people have to spread false narratives, and the fact that it can be a lucrative business. In the United States, we have seen similar incentives. Some of the biggest disinformation spreaders are actually making millions of dollars in a variety of different ways. So how can we reduce the financial incentives that many people have to spread false narratives?
For sure. I think I'll start with identifying that, talking especially with many election integrity officers, civil society leaders, journalists, academics in the majority world, in the global south. People are kind of like looking for a magic solution in the form of a legal framework that will be authored, and it will be international or transnational, and then it will just be copy-pasted into the local context. And I think that is something that many politicians are looking for. And if you also listen to citizens, they're looking for, like, what is that magical law that will kind of like address disinformation, hold platforms accountable? And my answer is that does not exist. And I think global majority leaders need to think about and trying to also argue and go beyond techno-legal solutions, right? That a specific framework that could hold platforms accountable that will magically reduce the quantity of disinformation in their local countries. I think what is needed are legal and regulatory reforms alongside long-term solutions in the form of digital literacy, in the form of patient investigative research, investigative journalism into these disinformation economies. It is about empowering coalitions that are about, addressing communities and empowering them at the grassroots. It's also much more creative, and that we need the skills and the talents of crafting persuasive narratives from artists, from storytellers, from filmmakers, to also influence, the kinds of interventions that so far are being led by journalists, are being led by legal experts. And so I think we need to be thinking about solutions in this kind of broad menu kind of approach, rather than just only looking at certain kinds of usual suspects leading the conversation in the disinformation space. So in my own work, actually, you were asking Darrell about how to actually target, disinformation workers. Certainly, there's pressure on platforms that we should be exerting, because a lot of these influencers who are spreading disinformation are getting their monetary payouts directly from platforms themselves. They're able to monetize their content. Content that is hateful, that is shocking, that is nevertheless very engaging to their viewers, directly from YouTube, directly from Instagram, right? And therefore, we need to pressure platforms to be monitoring who's actually being paid out of your ad technology. At the same time, we need to do more patient investigations and thinking about the workers involved in these. That requires a lot of investigative research. And I think it's also about empowering workers, and trying to support whistleblowers to reveal the mechanics of their campaigns, who recruited them, how did they get their jobs in the first place. So that's certainly something that I'm trying to do in my own research and also my creative interventions.
I think those are important points. I know a lot of people do focus on the content moderation responsibilities of the tech companies, but as you point out, we also need to focus on the money-making side of those tech companies and how the people who are creating and spreading the disinformation are making money off of that content. And the tech companies certainly have a responsibility to deal with the financial side of it and not just the content moderation. So, Maiko, you made several interesting points in terms of the importance of building trust in societies so that either domestic or foreign actors cannot exploit existing socioeconomic and political divisions, ways that society can protect itself by developing counter narratives. How can countries actually do this? Like, what would actually be effective in countering some of the disinformation efforts that we are seeing?
Thank you, Darrell. Well, I would like to point out two things. One is about the importance of training for the narrative analysis as well as creation of counter narratives. I myself have been doing it at my institute called the Institute for Global Governance Research at Hitotsubashi University. And what we do is that we train the youth in understanding who are targeted in terms of the psychological state that those targets have, and the type age group that they are in, and the level of education that they have, and so forth. And we try to understand to what kind of emotional aspect that the target has, those female actors are trying to sort of influence. And that analysis is very important in creating counter narratives, because we have to create positive narratives for the sake of the protection of democracy, human rights, and so forth, in a way that we can have impactful narratives for the same target, who have the same sorrow, same frustration, and same economic standing, and so forth. And so that's one thing. And oftentimes the importance of media literacy is talked about, but I would like to also point out the importance of literacy on those authoritarian countries and authoritarian actors as well. As a person who has been doing research on international relations and FEMI, including FEMI, Well, we can easily talk about those negative sort of aspects that those authoritarian actors like CCP and Russian government gives to our societies. But we should never become anti-China and anti-Russia, and rather we have to really study those countries, those governments, in order to have literacy about them. And that will equip us with the capability to analyze what they are trying to do, with what kind of tools and resources.
Okay, thank you. Those are great points. So I have one more question for the panelists, and then we will take some questions from our audience. And I will remind those of you who are watching this live, you can scroll down and there's a link where you can submit your question. Please include your affiliation and title, and we will try and get to as many of your questions as possible. So the question for the panelists is, how can we protect free speech while also countering disinformation? And we know that in a number of countries, one of the counter narratives that has developed against efforts to counter disinformation has been freedom of speech, that people have the right to say what they want, even if it's contentious or controversial. We know there are many contested facts in many countries around the world. So the idea that there is a truth that needs to be countered, or falsehoods that need to be countered, can be very challenging. How can we protect freedom of speech while also countering disinformation? And James, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you. I think it's really important to distinguish the nature of the problem in the way that I started in my original intervention. The reason that I've been working on that kind of conceptualization is precisely for this problem, because in many cases, in fact, we're not trying to counter disinformation, we're trying to counter foreign interference. So FIMI begins, the F in FIMI is foreign, which means the information manipulation begins from outside of the EU. And in many cases, the legislation is such that it's only foreign interference that governments are mandated to counteract. So I think it's important when governments are developing their frameworks, if you're focused on foreign interference, that is to say hostile state actors, non-state actors with tremendous capabilities that are similar to those of states, I think you're on quite safe ground. There's relatively low risk of that being seen as infringing on freedom of speech. But in that first category that I was talking about, the one that's to do with political participation and the ordinary rights of people to be wrong, or to say something that they know is a lie, if it doesn't cause any harm, they're often in many liberal democracies, you're allowed to lie. That's where we risk being seen as infringing on freedom of speech. So I think it's important in those cases that it actually isn't governments that are intervening there and doing the fact-checking or calling out individual citizens for being wrong, but it should be civil society, whether it's journalists, think tanks, researchers, people who have a position in society that gives them the justification to correct what people are saying that's wrong. So it shouldn't come from governments. And I think, we have to be really, really careful about not mixing these up. We've seen what's happened to the counter disinformation community in the US, where these court cases have been leveraged against many researchers because what they're doing is seen as interfering in domestic politics. I think a clearer distinction of what they were doing, which is in fact tracking Russian disinformation, might have protected them against some of those political attacks.
Thank you, James. Jonathan, your views on that. How can we protect free speech while also countering disinformation?
The sad reality is that in the global south, in a way, the greater threat to the information environment, a healthy public sphere, is not in a way disinformation itself, but the panic around disinformation and politicians who might be using that panic to seize control of the conversations, right? To seize control of the information environment. So working in Southeast Asia, we have many Southeast Asian countries that are, represent examples of contexts that have used panics around fake news to pass anti-fake news laws or to strengthen existing libel, cybersecurity laws to empower the political incumbents. To empower the political incumbents to go after opposition politicians. Obviously, that's their target. They want to stay in power, but it's also to harm journalists, human rights workers, academics, and researchers. And I think that poses a greater threat. In some of my other work, I said that the biggest bad actor in many global South countries is the government itself. And so I take your point, Darrell, that we need to be very careful about solutions, so-called solutions to disinformation, that and so-called cures to disinformation that are worse than the illness itself. And I think that's what some of these repressive measures are to control the information environment. I lean more towards transparency initiatives. Ways in which policies are there to encourage more transparency around the process in which some of the videos, memes, generative AI material are produced, like ways in which we can track the provenance of such content. So leaning more towards transparency mechanisms, compelling politicians to report on the nature of their campaigns, improving researchers' capacity to access data of platforms, to audit the algorithms within platforms themselves. Those transparency mechanisms are important rather than giving governments top-down control of the information environment in the name of control, in the name of, we want to fight fake news. I think we have seen too many examples that's being used for the worse.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Maiko, I'd like to get your views on this possible tension between protecting freedom of speech on the one hand versus countering disinformation on the other.
Thank you. I think this sphere of disinformation is sort of a unique sphere where everybody who conduct research on it can be considered or labeled as actors of some kind of propaganda campaigns, so we have to be very careful in that. And when thinking about the importance of free speech, we of course there are of course several things that we have to pay attention to. Many of them were already talked about, but governments will have to be have to sort of stay behind the scene as much as they could, so that they are not going to be considered as not only attacking free speech by implementing such things like anti-fake news laws, but also controlling tackling disinformation and being considered as surveying the speech. And so, we need private actors up front, but even private actors, private researchers, private NGOs, when we talk about disinformation and when we conduct research on disinformation, we have to make sure that we use very scientific method, which has to be data-based, so that we can always provide a proof. And just like Jonathan said, transparency is very important. So we have to be transparent in how we analyzed what and how we came into this conclusion. And also, it's a slightly different issue, but when we think about free speech as a human rights issue, we also have to pay attention to the fact that human rights issue per se tends to be hot button issues, and so they tend to be targeted as well, overall as a whole. And so, we in the society has to try to overcome controversies over hot button, those human rights issues. Be it LGBT rights, women's rights, minority rights, and so forth. And for that purpose, I believe because we need to build trust between different groups in order to bridge the gap. We need in-person discussions for that sake, and mini publics kind of exercises will probably help.
Okay, thank you, Maiko. So we're starting to get some questions from our audience. So the first one is, what kind of technical side solution is available in AI in terms of controlling and countering the disinformation problem? Is there any possibility for a joint R&D and operation cooperation among the US and its allies and partners? And what kind of role can Japan play in this regard? So maybe James and Jonathan, I'll ask you to focus on the first part, the technical side solutions, and then Maiko, have you address the role that Japan can play in this regard. James, we'll start with you.
It's a great question. I've just published a paper together with a colleague on AI and how it both can be used to create influence operations and how it can also be used to try to defend against them. At the moment, it's very messy. The systems are not very reliable. They change a lot. When they change, things break. It's very difficult to run a disinformation, like a bulk disinformation effort or an influence operation using AI as part of it. You can, but expect things to break. If you're using it to try to defend, it's very similar. It's a similar problem. The things you might find some things that are good at detection, but as soon as the next updated version of the ChatGPT comes out, the old versions are really bad at detecting what those new systems can do. So there's a lot of really kind of low-level operations level problems with this. But I think that in general, there's definitely room for allies to work together in developing these types of solutions.
Jonathan, your thoughts on technical side solutions. Can algorithms be part of the solution?
Yes, and I defer to a colleague of mine, very well-respected colleague, Sam Gregory, who's the program director of Witness. They are empowering human rights workers to use technology in various ways, and he's a leading voice in this space. And he is cautiously optimistic about the use of digital watermarks as a way of tracking AI-generated video and audio. And I think Meta has expressed that they will be using a digital watermark for any Meta products that are producing AI-generated video and audio, that it will include a label that it was imagined by AI. So that's a transparency mechanism, right? That's a way in which, okay, when this fake video of Joe Biden would be spreading, but used by using a specific set of tools by Meta, then it would be labeled as such. And hopefully less people would be, duped by such a video. So I think those kinds of transparency mechanisms are welcome. Sam Gregory has said that it's important that there should be more of a buy-in across different sectors and across different platforms and technology providers, that if it can't just be one company doing the watermarks.
So Maiko, I'll have you answer the last part of that question. What kind of role can Japan play in these operational cooperation activities between the US and its allies? And I should note, this question came from a political party member in Japan.
Yeah, okay. be it fact check bot or digital watermark, there has to be a collaboration of researchers, companies, and governmental actors to create this sort of more technical solutions to tackle disinformation. And one strength that Japan has would be that Japan has been playing various roles from behind the scene, and they are used to it. And as I said before, there's a very high political sort of nature in tackling disinformation, and we have to always be careful not to be labeled as trying to create some tools to spread certain propaganda or select some sort of information. So government being behind the scene is always very important, and I believe in the Japanese government would fit to play that role.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about teaching media literacy efforts, and I'll just throw that out, and any of you who want to address that. The question is, and this comes from an academic in India. The person asks, governments use their IT cells to spread false information, and many people cannot tell the difference between real news and fake news. Shouldn't educational institutions start teaching media literacy to raise awareness about the impact of fake news on society? Anyone who wants to jump in?
I can start. As an academic, I teach at the University of Massachusetts here in Amherst, and it's a state university. And, as an educator, I think it is important that digital literacy, AI literacy, critical text studies, these are all taught to young people, right? In a way that is empowering them. And also in a more dynamic way than how it's being taught right now. So there's a way of doing digital literacy that it's all about detection, that it's all about how to spot a fake from reality, that is dealing with neat binaries of this is true, this is false. I think digital literacy should include discussions of communication ethics, how to have conversations online in our current environment, in our polarized political environment. How should we have healthy and difficult conversations, right? How do we listen to another person of a different political camp, of a different religion? Like, these are components of media and digital literacy, insofar as our interactions with each other are technologically mediated through screens, through social media. I think there's a way in which digital literacy is all about acquiring skills. How can I be a better content producer? How can I create good TikTok that will get me money, right? And I definitely get students who sign up for my class. I teach a class on social media in everyday life, and a lot of my students want to be influencers, right? And I tell them that that's definitely a part of what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna be looking at influencer cultures, but we need to be including discussions of ethics and responsibility into these classes as well. So not just a technical transfer of tools, what is right, what is wrong, but it is about how to engage each other as citizens in a democracy, and how can we do that through our screens and interfaces nowadays.
I'm glad you mentioned this issue of ethics, and I worry that those students who are wanting to grow up and become influencers will also learn the lucrative nature of disinformation, and that might push them down on a dangerous path. We actually have another interesting question from a graduate student in Malaysia, and this person asks, How does disinformation influence the development of AI, given the fact that AI learns from the extant information that is already out there? And of course, as disinformation becomes more prevalent on the internet, there's the risk that generative AI may actually start to incorporate disinformation in the answers that it provides to other people, and therefore make the problem worse. So this graduate student wants to know, basically, how big of a problem is that, and is there anything we can do about that? Anyone who wants to jump in?
I could try to begin answering it. It's a very difficult question in terms of how much. I don't think we can answer that, but obviously we know that, as the person writes here, we know that the data that AI uses is collected from the internet, and we know that there's a lot of false information on the internet. It seems to me from the studies that I've been involved in that it's really a lot about the prompt. So the question that you ask the AI is tremendously influential in the type of answer it gets. So you may get the true answer for the first 5 times, but if you keep asking, if you keep digging, eventually you might get an answer that draws on disinformation, because the AI is trying to make you happy. How much of a problem is that? Are there other ways of solving it? Are there guardrails that some AI will have built in that other AI may not have built in? Because I think that's also a connected question that we don't know. But I would say there's clearly a risk that big companies that are producing their AI models, they may be very safe, they may only draw on facts, but then there'll be other versions of ChatGPT that are closed off, that are fed with disinformation, that could become extremely powerful tools for developing and spreading this information.
Maiko, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how much we should worry about disinformation actually affecting how generative AI develops.
Well, I don't have much to add. Well, because I don't cover this area.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from a reporter from Taiwan, and Maiko, perhaps I'll direct this question to you. Many studies on disinformation don't pin down its tangible effect on outcomes, meaning how directly the disinformation actually changes people's mind. Like, does disinformation actually work? And so the question is, what most convinces you that disinformation is having a major impact on how people think?
That's actually the million-dollar question, the most important part of this research, and the most difficult part of the research on disinformation, I would say. Well, for example, we can easily count the number of clicks, likes, retweets, and so forth, but they alone do not necessarily tell us that those people who tweeted are the ones who wanted to spread the information, those who liked the information. And so, well, I can think of several measures to gauge the impact of disinformation. One would be, well, very traditional sort of method, which is a survey method. So you compare the answers of well, people who perceive about certain issues before and after they receive disinformation. And if you want to talk about some actual disinformation which spread in the past, then you can also ask the target or the targets of the survey in well, counterfactual way. Well, in a way that what did you think well before the disinformation came in on this issue, and what did you think after that well you faced the disinformation? And also survey experiment is another method, and that has been used pretty often these days. And so well that's again a very similar mechanism where you compare the answers depending on what information you are given on a very similar sort of situation. And the method that I have been using myself have been text analysis. So I code adjectives and into, for example, like a positive and negative, and try to see what kind of countries are used together with positive adjectives and so forth. And there are many ways that you can code, but these correspondence analysis technique would also help you understand what kind of what kind of discourse that targets end up spreading.
So, James, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. Does disinformation actually have an impact on people? Does it change the way people see the world?
I think that a lot of disinformation isn't actually trying to change people's minds. It's come up before that often the people spreading disinformation are looking to polarize topics that already exist, to controversies that already exist, and they put the disinformation there not to change anyone's mind, but to fuel anger, to provoke emotional responses, to erode trust, to erode the middle ground in complex debates. So I'm not sure that the goal is really about changing people's minds. I think there are other objectives where we know. I mean, certainly you can survey trust. You can look at polarization in the US compared to 10 years ago, and so on. And they give indications. Disinformation isn't the only thing causing this, but as part of an ecosystem that's degrading public trust, that's degrading the quality of debate, probably it's part of it. But then the goal isn't just about changing people's minds.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the whole issue of impact, I think you're exactly right. Impact can take place in a lot of different ways. It can be changing people's minds, but it also can be fueling anger, as you point out, or it can also be impactful just by creating confusion about what the facts actually are. Like if you can paralyze people from a certain segment of the population at election time, that actually can be very important in a close election. So I think those are all good points. Jonathan, there's a specific question directed at you, and this is from a consultant based in India. And this person said that you mentioned the economies of disinformation and how it is linked to people's livelihoods. And the question is, how can we disincentivize misinformation? Is there an economic remedy to this problem?
Great question. And I think about my work on disinformation for hire as a specific intervention in disinformation studies. And disinformation for hire is a term coined by Craig Silverman, Jane Litvinenko, William Kung, writing about dark PR firms and how the combination of human brute force and new automated tools of public relations firms are being used around the world to influence elections, to seed hateful narratives, to stoke interracial conflicts around the world. And obviously, as a PR firm, it works as kind of like a client and also somebody providing a service, right? So it is a product of organized labor, but within a commercial enterprise, right? And I think that's fascinating for me to think about, because there's a way in which disinformation studies conceptualizes all of this as a political problem, right? That it's about people's ideological investments in anti-democratic or extremist belief systems, or it's about foreign adversaries like Russia and China against other countries. But disinformation for hire as a frame focuses not on radicalized individuals or disenfranchised populations, but it is about the hustle culture, like hustlers, tech-savvy entrepreneurs who are just wanting another financial stream. And if we're gonna offer our services to a politician, then we're gonna take that that service as well. So I think what can be done about this, we need to support long-term investigative research. and very patient investigative journalism. I think some of the most fascinating work on this have been like long-term research that requires immersion within these cultures, actually interviewing workers, cultivating relationships with whistleblowers within these companies. Look at the Guardian expose of the Team Jorge operators, right? Like the Israeli firm offering their services to seed narratives in foreign elections, and how the story of the disinformation villain there is not about like this all-powerful autocrat, right? Like who's got full control, but it's about this person who's saying, I'm just doing my job, right? Like none of what I did was illegal under any kind of law. And I think that's fascinating to think about, that disinformation has a very slow burn banality of evil to it. And it's not just about the Dutertes or the Bolsonaros or the Trumps, but it is about the complicity in which we allow it to happen from within existing industries. And therefore, we need more exposés to do that. We need to empower workers to actually call out unethical practices from within their companies, from within their sectors. And that requires long-term solutions rather than just easy fact checks and quick and easy responses.
I think that is a very important point about the need for more research on these questions, but I think research is actually very difficult because the tech companies have all the digital data, because a lot of this is taking place on their platform, and it's hard for researchers to get access to that. So perhaps one of our recommendations should be there needs to be more access on the part of the tech companies for the academic community. Maiko, I think we have time for one more question. I will direct this to you. And the question is from an American student who asks, this person says, disinformation is a very hot buzzword, but isn't fraud, half-truths, and other things as old as text itself? Why has disinformation suddenly become such a hot topic?
Well, that's really true that there has been the issue of disinformation from basically this issue has been there in the entire history of the human being, and so there's nothing new about it. However, the arrival of the SNS and the attention economy model that the SNS uses made it very easy for people to circulate emotional sort of information. The SNS platforms make them go viral, and so that's how those false information, which captures people attention, started being very viral. And together with this filter bubble, where people people in a similar sort of belief share the same kind of information within their bubble, end up feeling that the universe that they are perceiving is the entire universe, which strengthen their political belief, and whatever belief they have actually worsens the political divide, social divide within the society.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now, we are out of time, but I want to thank our speakers for an invigorating and informative discussion. James, Jonathan, and Maiko, each of you raised a number of important points. We clearly face a number of threats this year and thereafter. But as our speakers outlined, the situation is not hopeless. We still have human agency over this problem. As the panelists have pointed out, there are a number of things that we can do: digital literacy programs, greater transparency about AI-generated content, improved fact-checking, developing counter-narratives, focusing on counterintelligence against foreign adversaries, building trust in societies in general, just so that other people cannot exploit the existing socioeconomic and political divisions that exist in many different countries. I also want to thank the audience for tuning in. We'd love your feedback on how to improve this series. If you scroll down, there's a link to a webinar satisfaction survey, so you can fill that out and offer your views on this event. We also want to thank our host for Asia Undercurrent. That includes Nikkei and the government of Japan. Stay tuned for the next webinar, which will take place in March, and it will focus on Japan's economic growth. Thank you very much for joining us today.